on this computer. So just on the recording side, just sort of keep that in mind. I mean, we're not going to be talking about anything we don't want anybody to know, but yeah, sure. Just I always like to make sure folks know. But I'll share this with those. I'll share this with the other guys, and I'll probably, if you're okay with it too, I'll probably just put it on my YouTube channel and make it public there. So just keep that in mind, you know, for what it's worth. So I watch. So I think what I'm going to do is each week I watch, like I went through and just watched the intro section. There was intro, and then I can't remember the very first section, just, you know, talked about setup and stuff like that. But I watched the intro section, then made notes on that. So probably what I'll do is watch the section, hopefully right along with you. If you'll plan on at least the Monday prior, like whatever this section is, like since this is week one, I'm saying we watched section, I guess, 1 and 2. Let me look right now. In fact, let me open this up. So yeah, it was section, right. So it would be section 1. So the weeks will correspond to whatever section. So for instance, obviously next week is week 2. So plan on watching week 2 next week. And I mean, if that ends up being too much, or these, I haven't actually been through this entire course. I think I only got maybe halfway through section 2. So if these are maybe more sophisticated than what I think they are, they deserve some more time, then maybe we'll break them up. Okay. But what I plan on doing is let's plan on watching the section prior to that week, and then I'll sort of make notes, and maybe we'll have a short lecture. I mean, I'm not big on, I think lectures have merit, so it's worth talking about stuff, but I'll just make notes about high points and maybe lecture a little bit, and then we'll just get our hands dirty with some code. And, you know, maybe I'll give you, if you're up for it, maybe I'll give you guys a little, and again, if the other guys are following along too, maybe I give you some small homework things to do, and we'll just sort of see how that goes. Solid. And as far as the app side, yeah, we'll build. I'm assuming, and again, I'm making some assumptions about this kind. I'm assuming we're going to be building an app. I'm assuming each section won't be sort of standalone. Hopefully, we'll be building some app along the way. So we'll build that app. We may just sort of have a sample app of our own that we're going to build, and maybe we'll work together on. And then we've got what Vetsu Code called I think FNG tracker is what they called that. So we'll come up with our own name for our app. But essentially, my thought is, you know, I did mentor, and I sort of led the mentors in Vetsu Code for about 2 years. So I think I have a pretty good idea of what that's like. And one of the challenges there is just linking up mentors with students. So an app that would do that, and that's like the perfect app for Rails too. I mean, you've got this association going on, so you can just picture in your mind, and maybe what we'll do is flesh these requirements out. In fact, I've got a Vetsu Code app section here, so maybe what we'll do is flesh these requirements out as we go. But basically, we're going to want a I'm just going to keep things simple and say list of students. Students are going to have, when we're thinking about attributes of a student, obviously first name, last name, all those things, but students are going to have a cohort. So fall of 2020, spring of 2021, that kind of stuff. So we'll want to keep track of those things. This app, we're going to also want a list of mentors, and then we're going to want to associate students with mentors. So there, you know, yeah, the sky's the limit with something like this, because there's all kinds of things we can add them. We could also keep track of students, and I mean, there's, you know, as students graduate and go on to get a job, we can add their GitHub profile where they're working. So we can do all kinds of stuff with this. But my thought is, for the short run, the sort of minimum viable product I would like us to create is list of students, list of mentors, and then being able to associate mentors with students also. I'd like a section. It would be great to have a notes section where mentors could keep notes about their students and contact they're having with them. I don't want to get too big brother or anything like that, but I mean, there's
Sure.
all kinds of stuff. So
Sure.
obviously we need authentication. We'll need to add authentication with this. We don't want anybody just being able to go out on the web and see this data. So we'll want to add auth and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, that's I'm thinking, a couple of weeks in, three weeks in or so, we should have enough knowledge to at least go ahead and start laying the groundwork for this app and sort of start to build it as we go.
Cool.
Let's see. Yeah. We'll upload stuff. I mean, Heroku is my host provider of choice, especially for Rails stuff. So have you used Heroku any or
I have, but it's been a while. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not, Heroku is not lost on me.
Yeah. And I mean, this, and again, for apps like this, it's great because, number one, it's free, but it's fairly robust too. And when we don't have a lot of, for management backend type apps where you're not having thousands and thousands of people log into it, it's great for that. So,
okay.
And then we've also got opportunity. I maintain remote gig. In fact, there's something that there's something needs to be fixed there now, and I'm not even sure. I think the domain name might have died. Yes, it did. So it has moved to remotegig.locklear.me. Just because I didn't want to pay $30 for the domain name anymore. Yeah. And this I need to update the certificate too. So that's So we've got some work anyway.
I would love to learn that portion because my personal site throws that same error, and I'm lost on that. So
well, we need to update. Yeah. So no, and that's little stuff we can do. Their certificate. Well, the original, the certificate for remotegig.io is for that domain. It's not for remotegig.locklear.me. So we need to go ahead and update that. So that's something we do. But remote gig, have you seen that? Or I mean, I've shared it in Bets Who Code some. Have you ever visited the site? Yeah. So it's a list. It's a list of remote jobs. I've got a nightly cron job that runs and pulls jobs from about a dozen or so sites. The majority of them come from Stack Overflow, but I've got a bunch of other job sites too. Anyway, that app is a Rails app. I maintain it on, so we'll plan on doing that too. But I maintain it on GitHub. Remote gig is here, so and it's completely open. Everything you need to run it is here. So we'll have you clone that. How confident are you with Git as far as being able to clone a repository, that kind of stuff?
I will not have a problem cloning that. I can fork it, bring it down, clone it, build it.
That is going to be your homework for the week, is to, let's see, homework. And for the guys listening to, if you're listening to this after the fact, so let's do a homework section. I'm just going to say clone. Clone remote gig and get it running locally. I'm just going to say that. Ping me if you have questions. You probably have questions. I mean, so I've got instructions here, but I mean, basically follow these, but let's see. If you do Rails get jobs, it should run. So you should technically have everything you need here. That's another. What? Go ahead.
Have a Snickers. It might take a while.
Okay. Although it's faster, I'm trying to think. I may have sped it up some, but anyway. The other thing is, like, if these instructions don't work or there's something missing, you can update these. Feel free to update. Feel free to do a pull request and update these instructions. That's often, that's one of the things I do first if I'm working on a public project like this. When I go to the README and try and you know, these initial steps of just cloning a project and getting it to run locally, if I can add some context, because you never know. If I'm running Mac and somebody else is running Linux, then maybe the instructions aren't quite right, or that there's an additional step you might need to take. So that's the kind of stuff that's great to update a README, and so you make it easier for others. So yeah, that will be your homework, is to get remote gig running locally. And again, feel free to make any pull requests or changes you like to see to the README. Okay, so any questions? Because if not, I'm going to sort of dive into the sort of lecture part.
No, for your background or for your info, I worked on openacademy.io has a Ruby background, kind of a Ruby course, and it's a full stack. They go through everything. It's a free site to kind of go through all that stuff. So I've been working through that just to kind of work Ruby syntax and methods and kind of how they all fit.
Is it good
inside of Rails?
Yeah, I mean, do you feel like it?
You know, compared to nothing, it's awesome, right? I don't know anything else, but it's putting some context around some of the things are making me scratch my head. On, I haven't got into the Rails stuff. It's all Ruby is what
and that's good. And so that brings up a good point, that there's a debate about, when learning Rails, is it better to spend, a week, 6 weeks, two months just learning Ruby and the basics of Ruby before you jump into Ruby on Rails? I'm generally on the dive right in side, which is just go straight to Ruby on Rails. Now you need to understand Ruby, so you probably need to be simultaneously doing some Ruby work, but it's not, I guess, in an ideal situation, I guess, if I was maybe onboarding a new employee, so I knew that I had them for 18 months, then yeah, I might take a month or 2 months and just do some Ruby work first, before diving into Ruby on Rails. But that would be in an ideal situation like that, where I knew there was going to be this long relationship I was going to have with someone. In a sort of a more academic environment, I'm okay with diving right into Rails, and then you're going to supplement that with some Ruby, because you're not going to be able to do Rails without knowing some Ruby. So you're sort of simultaneously learning both at the same time.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's far out of reach.
Oh no, well, Ruby's easier. I mean, people people put Python up there with it, but I think Ruby's probably still, the easiest language to warm up to. I mean, just from a human readable standpoint, it's very easy to read it. Now, one of the downsides is, and I've said this about Ruby too, is the sort of natural language aspect to it is great, but the downside is there's a gazillion different ways to do something. There's a bunch, and there's some really clever code that you can write, and I use that not in the most flattering way. I'm actually not a fan of what I call clever code. I'd rather something be explicit and easy to read, and even if it takes 2 or 3 lines, I'd rather that than a clever one-liner. So that's but anyway, that's what you have to look out for, is sort of the more advanced you get in Ruby, the more sophisticated work you're doing, you sort of run into more sort of, again, what I call clever code. So that can be one of the pitfalls. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these notes. Just sort of, I watched again for those following at home. This is section 1. Section 1 in the Ruby on Rails 6 essential training course. What is Ruby on Rails? And so I watched that, and then I sort of made some notes along the way. So I'll cover those. So first, Ruby versus Rails. So we just talked about that some, and just make sure we understand the difference between those two. Ruby is the programming language. Rails is the framework. Ruby on Rails is written in the Ruby programming language. Just a little bit higher view when we talk about languages versus frameworks. Frameworks are these sort of collections of methods and code and things that allow you to execute various tasks or do different things. Generally, when we talk about a framework, at least in my mind, when I think about a framework, I'm thinking about a sort of a collection of code that's going to allow you to either create an entire website. When we think about web development frameworks, generally what they allow you to do is create views and HTML code along with the sort of database kinds of things and all of these other pieces that you'll need to create an entire website. It's important to sort of mention the difference between a CMS, a content management service versus just sort of a more general web development framework, right? So the example I like to use is, when you look at WordPress, you could do some very sophisticated things with WordPress. Now, you wouldn't call it a web development framework. It's a content management system. Now, you can, with a combination of plugins and all kinds of things, you can do some very sophisticated work with it. So think about our Vets Who Code app that we want to build. We want to track students. We want to track mentors. We want to make association between those things. You can do all those things inside WordPress if you want. But again, that's sort of not WordPress's strength, right? Content management, managing pages and posts and sort of that kinds of stuff. That's WordPress's strength. So, it's the old saying of, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you don't want to, I can drive a nail with a crescent wrench, but that's not really the right tool, right? A hammer is the right tool. So, when we think about, all the tools at our disposal, either from a web development standpoint or from a programming standpoint, it's important to choose the right tool for the problem we're trying to solve. When my church came to me and said, hey, we'd like to have a website for our church, I could do that in Rails, and Rails has some content management engines out there, but that's not really the strength, right? I mean, WordPress is perfect for that, because I've just got a collection of pages that I want to present to the public. I want maybe the church administrator to be able to log into the back end and modify the content. So WordPress is that. So I say all that to say, when we think about, when we think about frameworks in general, and then specifically we start to think about web development frameworks versus content management system versus e-commerce platforms, that's a whole other set of sort of tasks and tools that you've got to solve, if I want to create a shop to sell goods or something like that. So all of these things, and it's good that we've got all these tools at our disposal, but it's also burdensome, right? Because what you end up with is you're not going to be an expert in all those things, and you really, I've got, again, speaking about our church website, I sort of know enough WordPress to be dangerous, and I could probably figure it out, but I'm going to contract someone else. I'm going to act like the project manager, and I'm going to have someone else who knows WordPress and can do it in probably not even half the time I'll do it. She'll probably do it 4 or 5 times faster than what it would take me to do it. So, but anyway, that's when we talk about the language versus the framework. When we talk about the other sort of when we talk about comparable frameworks to Ruby on Rails, Django would be a comparable framework. Again, the language is Python, the framework is Django. So, and again, that's a web development framework. So it can really be anything you want it to be, right? It can be a content management system. It can be a database tracking system. It can be an e-commerce system. That's the beauty of when we talk about pure web development frameworks, is we can build them to be whatever we want them to be. Okay. Let's speaking of Ruby, and let's see, stop share. Speaking of Ruby, the language in general, let's open up our terminal. So I'm going to share my screen, and Greg, if you'll open up a terminal on your end too.
I do. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to share this. You can see my terminal.
I can see your terminal. Yes.
Does it need to be made low?
It's larger enough. No, it's okay. Big enough that I can see it. Yeah.
So if I type, so go ahead and type IRB, and IRB is interactive Ruby. Is let's see. I feel like IRB. I guess it's just interactive Ruby is what that is. So we can do, let's just experiment and try a couple things. I can do 4 plus 5 here. And notice the result is 9. I can do, let's see, I'm going to do var1 equals test. And so tell me what I just did there, Greg.
You assigned a string test to a variable var1.
Excellent. Yeah, that is exactly what I did. So so let's do var2 equals blah. So now if I do var1 plus var2, what are you going to guess that I'm going to get? And if you haven't done it yet, don't do it on your
We're
console.
concatenating strings together. Test.
Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen. Although sometimes you get some weird stuff. But yeah, you can see we got test blah. So all we did was add those, or all we did was concatenate those two things together. If we wanted to reverse, so var1 is that. If we wanted to print out var1 backwards or reverse it, how would we do that?
var1 dot reverse, using that method from
Yeah,
that string.
so yeah,
right?
and I wasn't sure. I thought that was what was going to happen, although I wasn't 100% sure. But yeah, so so this illustrates a couple things. Number one, everything is an object. So Ruby is an object-oriented is an object-oriented language. Everything is an object in Ruby. So in this case, var1 is a I'm thinking I think it's a string object, and as such, it has all the methods that are available to strings in Ruby available to that var1 object. In fact, if I do var1 dot and then I tab that out, so notice it'll say, do you want to show all 165? Okay, I can say yes. So notice these are all the variables, or these are all the methods. I'm sorry, these are all the methods that are available to var1, which is a string. So any string would have all of these. So, you know,
cool.
So there's our reverse. You know, I'm just looking at a few of these. There's an insert method that's available. I think you can insert a string into that. And if I do, well, let's look at a few others. You can do, here's all your sort of two methods, 2f, 2i, 2r. These are generally 2 float, 2 integer. I'm not sure what 2r is. 2s is going to be string. It's already a string, but so yeah, so you can sort of see all this. So that's sort of handy to have. If I do let's see, if I do dot, let's see, if I do dot replace, let's see if it gives us, yeah, it won't tell us. I think replace probably takes some arguments that we'll need to add to it to, I'm going to get, you know, just for kicks, let's just see what it does. I'm guessing one argument is going to be the position where you want to insert something or replace something. And then the next argument is going to be what you want to replace it with. So that didn't work. Let's try putting E in quotes. Nope, that didn't work either. Anyway, we could Google that and find out more if we wanted to see exactly how it works. But anyway, that's sort of what I wanted to show there. If we do, let's see, num equals 4. Let's do num1 equals 4. We do num2 equals 3. So we can concatenate these, right? Num1 plus num2. I'm sure you can guess what that's going to give you, 7. If I do num1 dot, and let's see if there's an interesting method here. Num1 dot even. Let's see, you can probably guess what that's going to do. Even, so we can, this is a Boolean method that should return either true or false. So num1 dot even, so num1 was 4, right? And so and so even returns true. Num2 was 3, so we can do num2 dot even, and that should return false, right? So again, that's just So the console is an and Rails has a similar console. In fact, has an exact console just like this too. So we'll be doing that once we start to build our Rails app. When we're trying to debug things, the console is an excellent place to be able to test methods. If there's a line of code, I mean, often in web development, what we end up doing is we'll make a change and then refresh the web browser to see if it's fixed. And you've got this constant, making a tweak, refreshing the web browser. And so often it's helpful, rather than going through that cycle over and over and over, is to actually do some testing and actually write code inside the console first. Once we know it works there, then we can take and move that into our code base or the actual application to actually see it work. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay.
No, I really like the dot after showing all the possibilities. That's
Okay, yeah.
help with
It's some
running
fun
through documentation, right?
Yeah, it is. And it does, again, this doesn't give you, if you have specific methods to take arguments, things like that, it doesn't, although there may be a way to look at some of that inside here, but it doesn't show you that, but at least it'll give you an idea of what methods might be available to you, if you're trying to solve a given problem, okay? So that is IRB. Let's go back to our document. So Open Console, so I've just got a note here that, Rails is the gold standard for web development frameworks. And some people would say, well, I don't think, when I say web gold standard, what I mean is Rails was the first web development framework to sort of put all these pieces together. The model view controller sort of standard that Rails set is still used in other web frameworks, slightly tweaked. I just built an application in Django and Python just because I wanted to sort of go through the process of creating a web application there. And, it's the layout, again, it's not exactly the way Rails lays things out, but it's very familiar. We'll talk about migrations and handling database changes and things like that later. But again, Django is very similar in how it does those things. So what I like to tell people about Rails is learn Rails, and even if you don't go on to be a Rails developer, many of the concepts and many of the things that you're going to learn in Ruby on Rails, you're going to see those in other web development frameworks too. So it's a great place to start. And again, really, Rails was the first framework to really put all these things together, and other frameworks have adopted, the way Rails does things, and a lot of the concepts you'll learn here. Okay. DRY, I made a note of. DRY is an acronym for do not repeat yourself. And so this is a general concept you see across not just web development, but just programming in general. And the idea is that you shouldn't be duplicating code. Anytime you see code that obviously is exactly the same or even very similar, is doing a very similar thing, then a light bulb should go off in your head that says, do I need to abstract this code out into a method or a class or some type of reusable module or chunk of code that I can reuse? And Rails encourages DRY principles, not just in the sort of Rails way of doing things, but in the way it generates code, methods, and controllers, and those things. It does it in such a way that sort of encourages this idea of dry code. So that's something we always want to be thinking about is, do I have duplicated code in any place across my app? Because if we do, then we want to think about some way to bring that code together into a single module, method, or class. So we've got that code in one place, and obviously the idea there is if we need to make a change to this code, then we don't have 5 different places we're going to make that change. We just make it in a single place. So that's this idea of dry code, or do not repeat yourself. Convention over configuration. This is one of the terms you'll hear with regard to Rails, and essentially what that means is there's a Rails way, and in fact I've got it in the bullet statement right below it, that Rails, they like to say they're an opinionated framework, and that is when you generate an application, whether you're using scaffolding or not, when you're using the generators to create this code, it's making assumptions about how code should be structured. Now that has pros and cons, right? The pros of it are it's a familiar way to write code. Once you've sort of engrossed yourself in the framework, then you don't sort of have to wonder about where things are. The framework takes care of that for you, and so it sort of tells you where things should go. Another advantage to it too, I find, is when it comes to when it comes to either bringing in new developers you're going to work with, or you're starting to work on an existing Rails project. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of where code is and what the structure of code is. If you look at, and again, I don't want to call out any other frameworks, but when you look at many other frameworks or just languages that a lot of code is written in, it's really up to the developer or the architect on what the initial structure of the code was, and then that's sort of what it is from that point going forward. And it may be some sort of standard way, but much of that just falls down to what the preference of the architect or the person who initially developed the code is. So it's up to you as a developer to sort of figure all those things out on the fly. Rails takes a lot of that guesswork out. If it's a Rails app, even though I've never seen the code base at all, I know where the views are. I know where the controller code lives. I know generally what the models are going to look like and how they're going to be handled. So the advantage to that, and again, from a portability standpoint, if I want to bring other developers in to work on a project, if they have a Rails background, then there's some base level of knowledge I know that they're going to have, and it's going to make being able to bring new folks in and get them up to speed. They're going to be able to do that in a much quicker way than they might be able to do with other frameworks or code basis. Questions on that?
Not a question, but a comment. Thanks for explaining that opinionated Rails way, because I've heard that phrase more than once, and it kind of made me scratch my head to what it is. But once you put in the context of, like, every time I go in the models folder, I'm going to find models. It doesn't matter what the name of this web app is. As I look across all of these Rails built apps, I'm going to have my model in this folder, my view in this one. So that, thank you for walking through that.
And that they're sort of, when we talk about the Rails way too, it sort of even extends beyond the structure of the language too. There's just certain ways and methods of doing things that, in general, Rails folks will do. Now it's not as it might not be as hard coded, for lack of a better word, as some of the other things in Rails, but there's often Rails ways of doing things, doing very common things that you often have to do inside inside the web apps. And so there's something comforting to that. And I think I don't know, it'd be interesting to do some either to do personality profiles of Rails devs versus other folks, because if you accept it and you just go with that, I mean, I'm of the opinion, I'm one of those guys, like, I feel blessed to be in the web development space, and like, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, I'm not a rocket scientist by any stretch, so I like being in the space and being able to work in the space. I say all that to say, I'm not one that feels like I need to write my own, like, roll my own way of doing things. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I like the fact that there's already a way to do it, and I just immediately gravitate, oh, okay, they've already solved this problem, so I'm just going to do it that way. Other developers really they have their own opinions about things, and they want to solve problems a certain way, which is fine. But I'm more on the side of, hey, I mean, I've got so many other things I can think of I want to use my mental energy to do. I don't need to come up with a way to convert a date to a string. Let's say I'm just going to use the Rails way to do it. So, okay, so let's talk about model view controller now. So this is the image. I took this image from the LinkedIn course, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But sort of keep this in mind of this idea of your browser. It's going to when you make a request to a web page, you can see we're hitting the controller here. The controller, if it needs data, if it needs to load data from the database, it's going to get that from the model. You know, in this case, they've sort of separated the database over here and the model. You can think about the database sort of sitting out by itself here. And this could be a Postgres database. It could be MySQL. It could be Mongo. It could be Firebase. You know, any. So one of the things we like to say about Rails is it's database agnostic. So that means that it doesn't care about what database it's using. Not only does it not care, it doesn't really know. And we'll look at some models when we get into creating models and our database tables and the attributes for those tables. Rails has a standard way of doing those things, such that when it's going out and it's talking to the database, we're going to load different drivers for the particular database we're using. So if we're using MySQL, we need to load MySQL drivers. If we're using Postgres, we need to use Postgres drivers. So there are gems and drivers we need to do for each of those things. But the migration, and we'll sort of learn that term and talk more about that later. But the migration files, which is the structure of the database and the schema, all look the same regardless of what database Rails is interacting with. Now that there are some, so I'll say too, generally Postgres is the database of choice for Rails devs. You know, I don't want to go too far with that, but I mean, Rails is created. I don't know. I'm sort of hesitant to say that Rails is created to work well with Postgres. I say that with some hesitancy because I don't know. I can't say I know the guts of the framework well enough to know that that's the statement, but generally when you look at Rails apps, folks most often use Postgres. Now, I've got, you know, the production application I've spent the most time in the last few years, we used MySQL for the database, and you know there were no issues or problems or anything like that. So it works well with those two. But generally, when we think of and I often, if I'm creating a project from scratch, generally Postgres is what I'll use. Part of that is because Heroku is Heroku's the hosting provider that I generally use, and they use Postgres by default. So it just sort of makes sense to use that. But anyway, we'll be talking more about that. So again, to sort of close the loop here, browser speaks to the controller. If the database, if we need to pull any data from the database, we'll use the model to do that. That request is then sent on to the view, and then the response back to the client goes from the view sort of back to the browser. So that's sort of this, you've got this constant request and response cycle that sort of looks like this. Questions on that or comments?
No, I don't think I know enough about it now to ask about it. So as you'll
warm up
here,
to it,
it'll come to it, right?
Yeah. Just sort of keep all that in the back of your mind and sort of refer back to this image too. It's often if you're having a question or something's not working quite right, just take a second and go back to this image and look, and that sort of should give you a clue on sort of where to look.
It just intuitively things. It sounds like a separation of concerns here. Model does this, view does this, controller does this, and it just is gonna with that opinionated way. It's
yeah, and that's right. And again, what I tell people is all the major frameworks have some implementation of this. It doesn't look exactly like the way Rails does it, but it's pretty dang close. And if you'll, if you understand this, then it's an easy leap. So if you go on to work in Angular or again Django or some of the other larger frameworks, it's a pretty easy leap to make from this to to sort of look at how those frameworks handle things. So again, just to make sure I hit these points, model is going to be the data and the database. View is the presentation layer. So by default, Rails uses ERB templates. ERB is embedded Ruby is what that stands for. So we'll take a look at that. Pretty easy to understand, but essentially it's just HTML with embedded Ruby. So any place you have dynamic data inside HTML, we're going to be you've got spots that are going to be you can insert Ruby into those templates. And now Rails can play nice with React or Vue or all the other sort of major front-end frameworks out there. They're generally gems, and they're sort of Rails ways to do all of those frameworks. I mean, there are enough devotees to Rails that also want to use Vue or Angular or React, such that generally you've got folks that have already got sort of a standard way to do those things. Now there may be some variants out there. There may be different gems that will allow you to do it, but Rails gives you the flexibility for all of these things. Again, I mentioned that it's database agnostic. In some ways, it's sort of Vue agnostic too. Now, again, by default, now not probably not to the extent that the model is, but the Vue, while it's ERB templates by default, you can replace all those things with other with JavaScript frameworks, or there's other sort of UI and front end frameworks you can use if you like. And then the last one is the controller. And generally the way to think of the controller is it handles the interaction between the model and the model and the view. And again, we sort of see that here. The controller sits here, and the notice there's no arrow between the model and the view. Those two things can't talk to each other. It's all sort of handled by the controller. Any questions on that? That's basically that's basically all of the lecture that I want to do. Any questions, comments, or observations on that?
No, it's nice to observations that I have is knowing that it's database agnostic. That like lifts a burden off of me. I'm not having to realize, I don't have to figure out how to write SQL code tomorrow. Right? It doesn't matter.
That's really a good point. That adding
outsourcing it, right?
Yeah, adding the tomorrow part, because you will need to. I mean, if you get deep enough, any
Right.
project that's sophisticated enough, you're probably going to need to write. Now, Rails has its own way of writing SQL, so you can do it in Ruby. But the more sophisticated projects that I've worked on, production, level sort of sophisticated apps, at some point you're probably going to have to. I've actually got to fire up Postgres or MySQL, go to the MySQL console and write, figure out, similar to what we did with Ruby, where you can fire up IRB and actually sort of figure out the right code you want to write there. You're probably going to have some sophisticated queries enough that, I've actually got to go to a MySQL terminal window here and figure out exactly what query I need, and then go back and actually, you can put strings, actual raw SQL inside Ruby code inside Rails if you want, or again, you can use Ruby to do it. But to your point, there's a lot you can do without ever having to touch SQL. And it's only when you get, at a really higher sort of more sophisticated level, you actually have to think about writing SQL code. Okay. Let's see. We've got 15 minutes or so. I want to honor our time. You want us to try and clone the repository and see how far clone the remote gig repository, and let's see how far we can get. Absolutely. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Why don't you share your screen? Maybe share your entire desktop so we can see your terminal and your web browser.
Get in here. So I think what I have is this one. And all right, so I don't know why it's not letting me share more than one, but I figure you can see.
Well, I can
You're
see that
seeing the,
if you bring,
yeah,
I see your
okay.
web browser. If you bring your terminal to the front.
Yeah, I'll just pop the. So get this guy out of the way here. All right, so I'm going to go to GitHub and I'm going to search or jump to. I'll just plug in remote gig and see what
Yeah, I don't know if that'll bring anything up or not.
spits out there.
No, so go. Why don't you go to? I've got a link to it inside the document there.
Okay.
Yeah, just click on it right there.
Yep. Okay. All right. So this, I'm going to grab a hold of this guy here.
Copy that. Yep.
All right. And then I'm going to make a directory.
So now I
See,
cannot see your, let's see. So I guess you could only share your web browser.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to.
I'd like to see
New
your
share. I guess I'll just have to bounce back and forth between them if you can't see the screen.
Yeah.
I tried the little shift button there, but we'll get there. All right. So I'm going to go there and I'm going to make a directory.
So I would not create a directory because when you clone the directory, it's going to make a directory for you. So if you want the root directory, if you want it to be here, you can just do git clone and then paste that link in, and it'll create a remote gig folder for you.
Interesting.
So if you just do git, what do you see?
It's spitting out of some sort of error.
So if you just type git there, to just type git and hit return. Let's see what we see. Okay, yeah. So you've got issues there.
Well, that's interesting.
So what I would do is I would take and I would copy from XC run, copy that up to developer path. Well, actually, I was thinking right above there, the beginning of that line, the beginning of
here.
Yeah, that's probably good enough. And then paste that in your web browser and see what pops up.
Yep. So here looks the error.
Inactive developer path. I'm going to do it on my end too. Xrun solution Xcode. It looks like you don't have Xcode installed.
Yeah, but I'm certain
so let's not do that now, or you can do it now, but we can go and end. We'll go ahead and finish up because it'll take that'll likely take
100 years. Yeah, that one will take a while to get through. I just wondered if I could come through this way.
You might be able to, but you need the command line tools installed though. I mean, because we want to be able to do it from the command line, just so we're comfortable with that. Yeah. So you've got some work to do. Yeah, go ahead and you can go ahead and click install and let that start going.
I'll start sharing there just for the sake of not going through the pain and suffering of that. It's a little interesting to me that I've done this.
Have you done?
As I was sharing with you, putting rails, having rails on the machine and all of that. It's like I keep.
Well, and that's
into the same kind of.
Yeah, there's always little stuff like this you'll run into, but anyway, once you get Xcode installed, it'll be there. So
yeah. So as you can see, so I've got this. Let me get your screen right. So I got the Ruby going.
That looks good.
I got the Rails going.
Yeah, so you're good to go. And then did you say you're using RVM or RVENV or RBENV?
I think this is the one that I was
using.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that's fine. They're pretty. I use I think R, RVM is what I start out with. So that's just always what I've stuck with. But it's usually easy enough to figure out. And we really shouldn't be changing. I mean, for the work we're doing, we shouldn't be changing versions a whole lot. So it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
Okay. So your homework, we'll plan on meeting on Wednesday, and we'll just maybe hack some. We'll just plan on maybe working on remote gig, and maybe we can get you to do your first commit there, because I know there's one thing that's broken right now on the Twitter, but then I'll probably try and get the certificate fixed maybe between now and then too, so the website will at least load. But I know the Twitter, one of the things the app does is I've got a remote gig Twitter account, and it randomly pushes jobs out. It randomly pushes posts to the Twitter feed, and the link in the Twitter feed is using the old domain. We need to update that to use the new domain. So that might be an easy commit to do.
Okay.
All righty. So your homework is your homework is to get Xcode installed, and then be able to clone the repository. And then so for the guys, if you're still listening in, if you're listening from home, make sure you can, or go ahead and try, if you're able, clone the repository, the remote gig repository, get it copied down locally, and let's see how far we can get. Well, that looked like it went, but let's see, does it actually, if you do git now, see what it does. There you go.
So I don't,
easy peasy. So now change change directory to remote gig.
There it is.
And then, so yeah, it'll ask you need to install Ruby 264.
So this one is, I just do this. Huh?
So I would copy exactly.
I'm not going to work too hard at trying to
just copy
figure all
exactly
that out.
What they
So
give
we
you.
just copy that dude.
Yeah.
Copy that dude. Got coffee on my mind. I said coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This may take a bit. So you'll want to, now after you do this, because I think it creates so this will be a little, let's see, this will be a little RVM, and the same's true for RBE and V2, is this is going to create a gem set, right? So, and this can be for the other guys too. Ruby gems, there's this idea, or there's this thing that Ruby has, and they're called Ruby gems. And gems are essentially collections of code that you can add to your applications. And essentially, it's problems that have already been solved. So let's say you want to add authentication to your app. Well, there's a gem for that. Let's say you want to add a date picker to your app, right? We've all been to websites, and you can do these drop downs to choose dates. Well, let's say you want the nice little calendar that pops up where you can actually browse a calendar and choose a date. Well, there's a gem for that. And Ruby gems are available not just for Rails in the context of Rails, but even just straight Ruby apps. So thinking about Ruby virtual environments, you can have what's called gem sets, and essentially it's a separate, it can be a separate version of Ruby, but also a separate collection of Ruby gems that are installed. And I'll just stop right there, because you really will need to get deeper into it for you to really have some context for it. But gems is a whole thing, and it's from a Rails perspective, keeping your apps up to date. You're relying on these sort of external pieces of code, which gems are. So that's something you're sort of constantly having to manage inside Rails apps. Really not just Rails apps, but any Ruby apps that you're dealing with. Gems are a whole thing. So.
Yeah, I heard you repeat a phrase that resonated with me. There's a gem for that. So I kind of, that puts a lot of context around what gems do.
Think about it like apps. Think about it for an app for free phone, right? You've probably heard someone say, well, there's an app for that. If you're trying to do something on your phone, there's usually an app for it. Well, again, you can think it's a very similar construct inside Rails and inside the Ruby world. And most stuff that you want to do, that there's already a gem for it, and there's already somebody who's done it. Okay, looks like you've got RVM installed. So now if you actually, an easy way to do this is just to cd space ... So go back one folder.
Wait.
Yeah, ... And now go back into the remote gig folder, and I think you'll see it. Yeah. So right, so now it created, let's see,
Small fine,
okay.
Roku.
See, now I don't know, because see, I've got RVM. RVM used your gem file for selecting Ruby. Okay, right, RVM did it. But anyway, so now if you do Ruby -v, you should be in, you know, see now you're in 2.2.6.4, whereas I think you were in Ruby 2.3 previously.
Okay.
So just know that that's a construct of the application itself, right? I have some code that's set up in the application. So anytime someone downloads and installs this app, they're forced to install this version of Ruby. The idea there is it was built for a certain version of Ruby. There are some requirements there. So you don't want someone either using an older or a newer version of Ruby, because you don't know what, you don't know the results they're going to get. Okay, we are right at the top of the hour, so I'm going to stop now. So it looks like we've got you so far. Next thing would be to try to bundle and try to create the database and do all the things you need to do to actually get remote gig running locally. I'll leave that to you, Greg, and just ping me inside Slack if you have questions.
Sure will. Thanks very much for your time today. This was excellent.
And for anybody listening at home, I'll post this after the fact for the Vetsuko guys. You can ping either Greg or me inside Slack, and we can help out there. All righty. Thanks,
All right.
Greg.
Thanks. Bye.
See ya. Bye.